Hi everyone. This month I published a blog post and an open source repository on GitHub to show how to use Azure Developer CLI to create a logic app and connect with Dataverse. Since there are a lot of manual steps in this setup, I thought it will also be a good idea to record this as a YouTube video so that people can follow along and try out the commands. So let's dive right in. This is the repository where I have both the bicep code as well as the AZD setup and the dev container configuration. So the easiest option is to run this using code spaces entirely on GitHub. If you have dev container set up on your local machine, you can also run this in VS Code after installing the dev containers extension. But in this video, I'm going to use code spaces to run this. So now I am in code spaces on GitHub. It's entirely in browser, so I don't need to install any local tools or anything. Whatever I need to do, I can do entirely in the browser. If you have a look at the devcontainer.json, you would see that this has got all the extensions that I need in VS Code along with the command line. So this was a recent change, AZD as a dev container feature. So that is really helpful. So I can also try out the AZD commands right on the terminal inside dev containers itself. So since this other extension, that is the Power Platform DevTools extension, also brings across pack, I can also try the pack commands. All the commands I need, all the setup I need entirely in the browser. So this is much easier to get started with. And same in dev containers also, you need to install the remote containers extension on VS Code locally along with Docker, and then you'll be able to use the same setup. You don't need to install anything on your local machine. Everything will be run on the container. So I have pack as well as AZD to run this whole setup. There is one issue with the pack extension in this specific version, so I had to install the previous version. So the latest version as of 18th of July 2023 is 2.0, as you can see. But there is a bug on this extension that is not allowing me to create service principals. There is a ticket that I have created. If you are on the latest version of the extensions and you try to create a service principal, that is basically an app registration, you get this error. So you need to downgrade to the previous version. So the next step is just to log in both into pack as well as the Azure Developer CLI. To log into pack, you first need to create auth profiles. So I'm going to create an auth profile first. So pack auth create, and then with the env switch, this is going to ask you to sign into using this device code. I need to go into Microsoft device login, and I'm going to use the device code to sign into my account. Now I'm going to log into Power Platform using the Power Platform CLI. So that is done. Let me now jump into the code spaces, and you can see that it's logged in. So now I can go and say pack auth list, and it's going to give me the exact same setup as the previous command. So I have one auth profile setup, that is this Power Platform Power Apps page environment. So that part is sorted out for the pack. Next we need to log in into AZD. So we do AZD login, and then it's the same sort of setup. You need to log in using the device login and the code. So I'm going to type in the code using my account. Now it's AZD. Now if I jump back in, even AZD has logged in, and it's going to retrieve all subscriptions and get the cookies set up on my machine. In this case, it's code spaces. So So the next step is to create the app registration or service principal. We can do that entirely in Pack, or you can also go into Entra or Azure portal to do this. Since I use Power Platform CLI every day, I'm going to do this via Pack. So the command is pack admin create service principal. There is an environment switch that I need to specify for the latest version. But on the older version, since we are on the older version, we don't need to specify any sort of environment switch. This is the one that doesn't work. So I'm going to just do create service principal. So it is giving me an application ID and client secret. This is Azure portal. Let me just go and try to get the application ID of this. So this is the application ID. So with this application ID, I'm going to search for this app registration on Azure portal. I need to just switch to not from owned application. If you search for owned applications, you won't find any results. You go to all applications and you search for this, and you can see that there is a new app registration created today. The next step would be to assign a role to this specific app registration on the environment that you want to access. For this, we once again use pack. So the command is pack admin assign user, and you need to specify the application ID for the user switch, and then you need to specify the environment as well. So I'm giving this app registration role system administrator for the environment in our environment Power Apps page. So I'm going to run this command. You can see that it has given this app registration access to the environment as system administrator. I can go and check it out in Power Platform Admin Center. So this is Power Platform Admin Center for this Power Apps page environment. I go into S2S apps, which is all the application users, and if I search for this user, that is, if you search for this user, you can see that it's a user in this environment, and also it's assigned system administrator role. So the setup for the Power Platform environment is done. The next step is to run the AZD commands. I am on Codespaces on my repo, so I already have all the code set up. If you are on a blank folder, you can run this azd init command and get all the code on that local folder. But since I already have all the bicep files on this location, I'm not going to run this azd init. I would rather run this azd environment, azd env new command. So that's what I'm going to run. So azd, so I'm going to run this azd env new logic apps Dataverse dev command. That has created a .azure folder. Inside that there is an environment, and you can see an env file that currently has just Azure environment name parameter, I guess. So now next step is to copy all the values on the environment file. So go to the repo in GitHub and copy everything and fill up appropriate values, because application ID will be different, your location will be different. The secret that you got when you registered the application in Pack, you need that as well. And all these values need to be filled in, and you just paste it inside the specific environment folder that was created earlier, and just update all the values here. And then we need to run the azd up or azd provision. When I was recording the video, I also discovered that pack create service principal was actually not creating the secret, so I had to create this manually. So maybe better to do this directly in Azure. Now I need to make two key changes to this app registration, both because we are locking down the trigger for the logic apps using easy auth. So I need to add a scope. So let's first add an application ID URI and choose the default. You can choose a custom URL if you want to, but I'm just going with the default. I'm going to add a scope. I'm going to add the scope logicapps.run, fill in on the mandatory fields, and then add this. Next step is just to add the token for optional claim. I'm going to add an audience token on the access, audience claim on the access token. So these two are needed because some of this information is going to come through on the access token, and EasyAuth is going to validate that information. So without this, you won't be able to get the access token and execute that HTTP trigger on the logic app. So this is pretty important. Initially, I showed you how to log into PAC CLI and AZT CLI, but there is also another CLI that you need to log into. That's the Azure CLI. So let's just log into the Azure CLI using the AZ login use device code, because I'm inside a dev container code spaces, so I can't use the normal AZ login. So I'm going to log in using the device code. So now I'm going to sign into the Azure CLI. So this is going to sign in. So I'm signed in into the Azure CLI. So now let's start the provisioning process. Now it's time to deploy and provision the resources using AZD up command. So AZD up command deploys both the resources, creates the resources, updates the resources, as well as deploy the logic apps in just one single command. Now that the deployment is complete, let's go and check the EasyAuth settings for the functions runtime. So this is the part in the bicep code that I added to allow the application ID in the allowed audiences, as well as the allowed applications on the default authorization policy. If you go into Resource Explorer on Azure, so that is resources.azure.com, and navigate to your resource group, and then to the sites, and then to the config auth settings v2, you can just confirm that the settings have come across. You can see the application ID on the allowed audiences, and you can see the application ID on the allowed applications as well. This is how EasyAuth will enforce when you execute the HTTP trigger. Before we get the token using the app registration, you need to add one more thing. Go to Enterprise Applications, search for the app registration, and in the users and groups, add the user that you'll be using to get the access token. Now let's try to run the logic apps from Postman. So in order to run that, you need to open Postman here. You need to add this callback URL, which is how Postman gets the bearer token. So I need to add that as a redirect URI. So the URI is added now. So I'm going to copy all the URIs. So go to endpoints, copy the authorization endpoint. I'm gonna put it in the authorization URL. I'm gonna use the access token endpoint. I'm gonna paste it there as well. Client ID. Client secret. I need to place the client secret, and I need to paste the scope. The scope is here in the expose and API. I'm gonna copy that scope. And now we can just get the access token. Don't forget about the client secret. Now I'm going to try to get a token. Now getting a client token, I'm going to run this get new access token. So it's signed in. Let me just get back to Postman. Block pop-up, so I need to allow the block pop-up. Open that, and I'm going to open this Postman link. This is finishing the access token part. So that is the token. I'm going to click use token. Now we need to try to execute the logic app trigger using the access token which we have on the header. The trigger URL for the logic apps can be got from the workflow itself. So when the logic app was deployed by AZD, it would have created a workflow, the default workflow, and it looks something like this. So all it is doing is just getting a HTTP request, and it uses the environment URL parameter, that is basically the Dataverse environment, and entity columns and count are received on the trigger itself. So if you look at the trigger, you can see that it accepts the columns, count, and entity. So I am going to try to do the same thing. So in the body, I'm going to get all the solutions, and I just want to get the top 10 solutions, just these two columns. So let me try to send this request. When I try to send this request, I'm getting an error that I have both the bearer token as well as the SAS URI. This is because the trigger URL also has a SAS URI. I'm going to remove the SAS URI, which is the signature part, and then try to run it again. So now I'm getting a response. These are all the solutions that are in the environment. So the logic app trigger URL does not have any SAS URI. I am sending the bearer token that I got using Postman, and it is giving me the result. Now let's try just validate the easy auth part. If I try to use the access token that is not for the specific scope, I expect a 401 error. So now I'm going to try to get a new access token for a different resource and see what happens if I try to use this token. So I'm going to get a new token using Azure CLI, using that AZ account get access token, and I specify the resource as graph.microsoft.com. Copying the result into clipboard, I'm going to use the same token, and then I'm going to try to execute this logic apps. As you can see, it says that the bearer token has got an invalid authorization header. So this is actually blocking you from using a different access token which doesn't have the right application detail. So what is the right audience detail? So if you go into auth settings, this is the easy auth settings. You can see it allows only these three audiences, and the one with the GUID is actually the custom app registration, and allowed applications is also the custom application ID. So these are the ones that should be on the token. Now if I try to decode the token that I got from Azure CLI and paste it on this site, jw.io, you can see the audience is graph.microsoft.com. So of course, when EasyAuth checks the audience on the JWT token, it denies permission to use that token for the logic app trigger URL. But let me try one more time without the resource. I'm going to try to get the access token without the resource and use the same on Postman. This time around it is actually working. How is it working? So let me just copy this access token and paste it on the JWT site. The audience is management.core.windows.net, and management.core.windows.net is an allowed audience on the EasyAuths. That's how it's actually working. So I hope this video was useful for you to know how to use Azure Developer CLI to deploy logic apps and connect to Dataverse.